A missile barrage that unfolded not over days or weeks, but in the span of just 6 hours. 6 hours that reshaped the battlefield, 6 hours that tested alliances, 6 hours that brought Washington to its highest state of alert in months. What Russia did today crossed a line that the White House had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, ferocity, and an unmistakable message of defiance. This is not the story of a nation on the defensive. This is the story of a nation that has learned how to strike back, and strike back hard. For several weeks now, there have been signals, not official government statements, not diplomatic briefings, just signals that Russia was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military movements know the indicators: the repositioning of mobile launch platforms, the stockpiling of cruise missiles at forward bases, the increased encrypted communications between command posts, the sudden reduction of civilian air traffic in border regions. All of that went quiet, and whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. U.S. reconnaissance assets picked up unusual activity near Rostov-on-Don, near Voronezh, and deep inside Belarus. Satellite imagery showed what appeared to be Iskander-M missile systems being moved into launch positions under cover of darkness. But the silence from Moscow was what concerned officials most. No fiery speeches from Kremlin officials, no threats broadcast on state television, no diplomatic warnings issued through back channels, just silence. And in the world of geopolitics, silence is never peaceful. It is preparation. Early Thursday morning, U.S. Space Command detected what they described as a massive thermal bloom, consistent with multiple simultaneous missile launches, including launch signatures from platforms that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of strategic assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, intimidation, or a fundamental shift in battlefield strategy. Pentagon officials didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its posture, and when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, the entire national security apparatus pays attention. Within minutes, the National Security Council convened an emergency session. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was briefed in real time. President Biden was awakened and given a situation report before dawn broke over Washington. The initial assessment was grim. Russia had launched over 120 missiles in a coordinated strike pattern targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, military command centers, and, most alarmingly, civilian population centers in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Dnipro. This was not a tactical strike. This was a strategic bombardment designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses and deliver a psychological blow to the Ukrainian population. It was, in the words of one senior Pentagon official, the most intense missile attack since the opening days of the war. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, in briefing after briefing, described Russia's move as reckless, disproportionate, and, perhaps most importantly, indicative of a regime under pressure. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said plainly that the United States views this escalation as a dangerous departure from established patterns of conflict. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive and far-reaching we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of the initial Russian barrage, Ukraine launched a coordinated counteroffensive targeting Russian military assets deep inside occupied territory and, according to multiple sources, inside Russia itself. These weren't the standard drone strikes we've seen in recent months. These were precision-guided missile attacks using Western-supplied ATACMS and Storm Shadow cruise missiles, systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to deliver a strategic message. And tonight, that message was delivered with unmistakable clarity. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched counterstrikes on 17 high-value targets, including a Russian air defense command post near Mariupol, that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was preparation for a renewed ground offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate its gains. They hit ammunition depots in Luhansk. They hit fuel storage facilities in Crimea. They hit command and control nodes that were likely preparing to coordinate the next wave of Russian attacks. In other words, Ukraine targeted the logistical backbone of Russia's war machine, the infrastructure that would have made sustained bombardment possible. This is what made Washington's warning so urgent. Russia's missile barrage wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of escalation that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the conflict if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian targets, they didn't attack population centers, they hit military installations, they hit logistics hubs, they hit the machinery of war. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking from Kyiv in the aftermath of the attacks, made clear that his country would not be intimidated. Every missile Russia launches at our cities, he said, will be answered with a strike on their military capacity. This is not revenge, this is defense, this is survival. The precision of Ukraine's response surprised even Western military analysts. According to British intelligence sources, Ukrainian forces destroyed an estimated 40% of Russia's forward-deployed missile reserves in a single night. That is not just a tactical victory, that is a strategic inflection point. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Pentagon analysts now believe that Russia's latest missile barrage was designed to test the resilience of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington. Russia wanted to see whether the United States would waver, whether European allies would hesitate, whether Ukraine would buckle. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't buckle, the United States didn't waver, and Europe, far from hesitating, responded with a unified declaration of continued support that was so swift, so coordinated, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Russia's attention easily, but today the Western alliance did. Military strategists speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's attack as a stress test, a way to probe for cracks in the coalition that has sustained Ukraine's defense. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and determined. Their counterstrikes were not only devastating, they were calibrated so precisely that they destroyed military targets while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties. That distinction matters because it shows something important about Ukraine's military evolution. It shows that Ukraine is not merely surviving, they are evolving. They are not simply reacting to Russian aggression. They are anticipating it, they are countering it, and in some cases they are preempting it. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian ground forces carried out artillery strikes on Russian positions along the Zaporizhzhia front, forcing Russian units to abandon forward positions they had held for weeks. Ukrainian naval drones targeted Russian warships in the Black Sea that had been repositioned in the last 72 hours. Ukrainian cyber units, operating in coordination with Western partners, reportedly disrupted communication networks used by Russia to coordinate missile launches. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense, this was coordinated multi-domain warfare, this was strategic initiative. And strategic initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed assault on Kyiv in the opening weeks of the war. For every advance they have made, Ukraine is countered with something that complicates their position. For every city they have bombarded, Ukraine has struck back at the infrastructure that makes further bombardment possible. This is the reality Russia now faces, a reality where every escalation is met with a proportional and sometimes disproportionate response. Remember, Russia thought this war would be over in 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall within a week. They thought Western support would crumble within months. They thought Ukraine's military would collapse under the weight of Russian firepower. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is still standing. Western support is still flowing, and Russia's military is bleeding resources at an unsustainable rate. 27 months into this conflict, Russia has not achieved a single one of its stated objectives. They have not captured Kyiv. They have not removed the Ukrainian government. They have not prevented Ukraine's integration with the West. Instead, they have united NATO. They have galvanized European defense spending, and they have created a Ukrainian military that is now battle-hardened, experienced, and increasingly sophisticated. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest missile barrage happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense domestic and international pressure. Russian nationalist factions want more aggressive action. Military bloggers want visible victories. Economic elites want the war to end. And ordinary Russians want their sons to come home. Putin is balancing these demands while managing an economy increasingly strained by Western sanctions and a military suffering from severe equipment losses and personnel shortages. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. Tonight's missile barrage was not a sign of Russian confidence. It was a sign of Russian desperation, a desperate attempt to shift the narrative, a desperate attempt to break Ukrainian will, a desperate attempt to fracture Western unity. And tonight, all three of those attempts failed. Washington's warning, now circulated through NATO channels and shared with allied governments, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow unchecked escalation. Pentagon officials said plainly that Russia's missile barrage was inconsistent with any stated interest in de-escalation or negotiation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to tolerate it. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, speaking at an emergency press conference, made clear that additional military aid to Ukraine would be accelerated. Russia's actions today have only strengthened our resolve. He said, every missile they launch at Ukrainian cities will be met with more weapons in Ukrainian hands. That is not ambiguity, that is commitment. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation in a somber, defiant speech tonight. He said, they wanted to break us with terror. They have only made us stronger. He said, every building they destroy, we will rebuild. Every life they take, we will honor. Every attack they launch, we will answer. And he said, tonight, Russia learned that there is no missile large enough to break the spirit of Ukraine. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that the world is watching. He knows that history is being written. And he knows that Ukraine's response tonight will be remembered for generations. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's missile barrage wasn't isolated. Along with the aerial bombardment, Belarusian forces conducted military exercises near the Ukrainian border. Russian naval vessels increased activity in the Black Sea. Russian cyber operations intensified attacks targeting Ukrainian government networks. All of this happened within the same 24-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Military analysts are watching closely for signs of a renewed ground offensive. Intelligence assets are monitoring for additional missile stockpile movements, and diplomatic channels are working overtime to prevent further escalation. Pentagon strategists are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a major spring offensive and use tonight's barrage as a softening operation. Another is that Russia is attempting to force negotiations by demonstrating its remaining strike capacity. Third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to test whether the West has red lines it is willing to enforce. But today, Ukraine took that question off the table. They didn't wait for Western approval. They didn't hesitate. While committees debated, they didn't ask permission. They responded with force. And that response sent a message that will reverberate through the halls of the Kremlin. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine's allies will tire. Ukraine wants to show that its capacity to fight remains unbroken. Washington wants to prevent nuclear escalation, and Europe wants to prevent the conflict from spilling beyond Ukraine's borders. All of these interests are now converging in a moment of maximum tension. The next 72 hours will be critical. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian command networks for signs of further attack preparations. They say Russian forces appear to be regrouping after suffering significant losses from Ukrainian counterstrikes. They say communications intercepts suggest confusion among Russian field commanders. And they say Russia's decision to launch such a massive barrage is likely part of a broader strategy intended to demonstrate resolve despite mounting losses. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Russia that escalation will be met with escalation. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine remains a capable and determined partner. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with tonight's attack. But what we do know is that Washington's response was timely. It reassured allies, it reinforced deterrence, and it demonstrated that Western support for Ukraine remains unshakable. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 48 hours. If they pause to reassess, this moment will be remembered as a turning point, a moment when escalation was met with resolve. If they continue their attacks, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Russia appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet, it means they're thinking. It means they're choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have learned many times before. Ukraine will not break. The West will not abandon its allies. And escalation comes with a price. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine remains defiant. Washington remains vigilant. And the alliance remains unbroken. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.